Oh mate, I'm tight as. There's nothing but spiders and cobwebs in my wallet. Hey guys, MiracleMAX here. Welcome back. Do you ever get a squeaking sound or a metal grinding sound every time you apply your foot on the brake? That may be a result of worn out brake pads or damaged rotors. That's what I'm going to show you how to replace today. Just keep in mind that this requires a certain amount of skill and equipment to carry out this task. If you don't have that, it might be worth taking it to a workshop. This is a safety issue, so just be aware that you need to be careful. Of course, further diagnosis of the individual vehicle is required to prove that it is faulty brakes. But for today, let's get into it. As should always be the case, safety comes first. Since we're working on the front wheels or the front brakes today, we're going to chock the rear wheels. I've just got a couple of blocks of wood here, one at the rear of the tyre and one at the front of the tyre, plus I've got the handbrake on. That'll keep us safe and stop the vehicle moving when we actually jack it up into the air. So probably for a lot of you guys out there, you don't have specialist tools, air equipment, etc. So what I'm going to try and do today, as much as I possibly can, is use the tools that you most likely will have. If not, I'll guide you through the equipment that you do have. So rather than use my air tools to get the wheel off, I'm going to use a wheel brace. Now, the first thing to do before you lift the vehicle up in the air is to loosen all the nuts. Now you notice all I did was loosen the nuts. I didn't undo the nuts. The vehicle's still on the ground. They're just loose enough now so that when we jack it up we can undo them easily. If you're using the jacking equipment that comes with the vehicle, you should be looking for a solid area. In this case you can see this box section which is attached to our chassis rails. Sometimes you will find, not in this case, but some cars will have little cutaways that come down. And your jack will slot into that. They may have two little slots cut out of them, and that in turn is where the jack will go up to. I can't show you in this case, but if you had the jack that comes with this vehicle, this is the area that you would jack on for this particular vehicle. But since we'll be using the floor jack today, I'll show you the cross member that it has to sit on. This is the cross member right here. We jack it up on that, and that should safely lift our vehicle. You get the idea. It's a good idea not to raise the tyres too high off of the ground, particularly these big fellas. They're heavy suckers, so you want them as close to the ground as possible, but off the ground so that you can rotate the wheel. And we can safely lower our vehicle onto our safety stands or jack stands. We can now safely remove our wheel nuts so that we can pull off the wheel and access our brake pads as well as the rotors. Once the wheel is off, it's not a bad idea to put both the nuts and the wheel under the vehicle for safety's sake. You're not going to have a tripping hazard here, plus if it ever comes off the jack, it's going to land on the wheel safely rather than either on you or on the vehicle axle, etc. Depending on the style of brake caliper that you have and whether you're just replacing the brake pads, these two sections in here, or if you're replacing the rotor itself, as to what you undo next. If you were to just replace the brake pads, it's quite easy on this particular style, just undoing the one single bolt down here opposite to the hose, and then just tilt the whole caliper up like this. It pivots up like this. You can then access your brake pads without having to remove the whole caliper frame. But in this case we're doing the disc as well, so we need to remove the entire caliper, including the stationary frame, to access our rotor. So in our case we'll be removing this particular bolt as the bottom caliper bolt, and the top one, which is this one here. Some of these bolts may be quite tight because being rusted in place, or all the dirt and stuff stuck in behind the bolt head, so it might require a little bit of effort. Got him. And of course the top one. Once you've undone those two bolts, you may need to use a screwdriver to lever the caliper itself off in between the disc rotor and the actual frame itself. The reason being is sometimes they get a lip on the edge of the rotor and it pulls on the brake pad, which holds it into place. So this might take a little bit of effort to get off. There we go. Also, you don't want to let it hang off the brake hose. You can cause some damage to the hose. It's not a bad idea just to locate it on something, or perhaps even hook it up with a piece of wire onto the spring that is located on the suspension above there. In this case, mine will sit up there nicely on the top of the wishbone. Okay, disc is off next. This style of brake disc is known as a hat because it comes separate. It doesn't actually come with the hub assembly attached to it. It's a separate unit altogether. As you can see here, we're using slotted ones, curved slotted style, and they're also labelled as left and right so that they go in a forward direction to get rid of the heat and any water that's located on there too. But as you can see, it's not coming off easily. Obviously it's rusted onto the hub itself. It might require a little bit of persuasion. I'm going to use a little bit of freeze and release around where the studs come through for the wheel, and also where the hub and the disc meet. Hopefully that might help release some of the rust, etc., and lubricate it so I can hit it off with a hammer. These people live on a farm property, so I'm sure that these are rusted on pretty well, and believe me, the smell is not fantastic either. There's how can I put it? There's a lot of cow perfume around, let me put it that way. Okay, let's see if we can get this disc off. Using my big boy hammer, I'm going to hit the disc. Now I'm not going to hit it on the actual machine surface, but rather on the hat area, or where the disc itself locates onto the hub. Notice the sound change as I hit it, and I can actually feel that it's starting to move off on the bottom. Now if I hit here, it should actually tilt this way. If I hit here, it should tilt that way. So I'm going to go backwards and forwards, and eventually, hopefully, it should come off. Awesome. You'd have to agree, if I left it like that, it wouldn't be easy to fit the new disc. So I'm going to use some emery tape to tidy up around here so that the hat or the disc itself can slide on easy. Just something to keep in mind when you're ordering parts. This is an ABS style, or anti-lock brake system. And you can see this tone ring, or this little cog thing in the background here. So the discs may actually be different. So when you order the parts, make sure that you order the ones, in this particular case, with ABS. So as you can see, I've cleaned up the surface around here to get rid of any surface rust or stuff that's stuck on there, which would get behind the disc itself and create a problem. If it's not sitting correctly, it may tilt and of course end up with a vibration like this. It's come up nicely. Next step is to prepare the disc for installation. You're probably thinking to yourself, prepare the disc, it's brand new, why should I have to prepare the disc? Well, in a lot of cases the manufacturers of the discs themselves put on some sort of waxing surface to protect it from rust before it's actually installed. So we need to use something along the lines of brake cleaner to clean off that surface wax, because otherwise that will get onto our brake pad itself, and we certainly don't want that. See, it comes off. Make sure you use the correct type of cleaner. Don't use anything that's oil based like petrol, because otherwise that will create a surface on it as well. Nice. and as I mentioned before, L has been written on there because it goes on the left hand side. It doesn't require any special installation, it simply goes on like this, in theory, like that, and of course it'll be held in place by the wheel. Next we have to do our brake pads. So not everyone's going to have a kit like this. It's a piston rewind tool which we can push the piston in the caliper back to separate it, but I'll show you another method that you can use. Obviously as the disc pads wear, they get closer and closer and closer to the caliper. The piston in turn has to move in this way to apply the clamping force on the braking pads. So therefore when we put in pads that are thicker than these, the piston needs to be forced backwards to allow for the thicker pads so that the new pads can go over the new rotor. Generally I would use my piston rewind kit, but in this case I'm just going to show you a bit of a trick. What you can do is use a couple of screwdrivers, a couple of whatever it may be, and you can force that backwards. It may take some extra effort. You may have to use several different types of tools, but to try and force that piston with the old pad still attached so that it goes backwards. Another method that you could use is putting a G-clamp between here and clamping it backwards, winding it backwards, and that in turn will push the piston backwards that way. Also be aware that as we push the piston back in the caliper, the brake fluid level will want to rise. In that case it's not a bad idea just to lift the brake fluid cap off in the master cylinder, put it to one side. You can see already that the fluid level is quite high. I'm going to have to drain some of that because both pistons need to be pushed back, and that fluid level will continue to come up. Brake fluid will go over our paintwork and strip it. It really doesn't take long to strip paintwork, guys. Be aware that you don't want to mess with brake fluid. So I'm going to drain some of that fluid off now. My piston is now pushed back all the way. I've pulled out this disc pad. I need to pop out the other one like that. Just be aware that some have clips on them. This for instance, this one here, has a warning tab. Now, can you see that? That tab, when it starts to rub against the disc, will make this horrible squealing noise. Doesn't mean that it's worn out the disc rotors. What it means is that your pads are now getting down to the legal limit and should be replaced. It'll just make this really annoying sound. So if the new pads have that, I need to fit it correctly on the inside. Also, some of them have backing plates, as you can see. Of course, you'll notice there's other clips here and here which need to stay in place. Don't let them fall out. That's where the pad is held in by spring tension. These are the super duper pads that I'm putting on. The customer has supplied me with all the parts. You can see they've got a chamfer on them. I don't know if that's any good or not. In my opinion, the chamfer means that you've actually got less clamping force or less surface area of the brake pad itself. So in actual fact, you've probably got less braking capabilities than if this chamfer was not there. Just like the old one, see? There's no chamfer on that. Therefore, you've got more surface area to apply to the disc. Here, you have less. Yeah, I don't know. Here you can see the new pad has the backing plate already assembled on it. You don't always need to, but it's not a bad idea to apply something like this disc brake quiet. The actual noise, the brake squeal and all those sort of weird noises that you get, is actually between the caliper itself on this side going onto the back of the pad, or if it's on this side, it'll be where the piston pushes against the back of the pad. This is where all the noise comes from. So just putting a little bit of compound on there will give it a cushioning effect and will stop any of that vibration or squealing noise from happening. I didn't notice before, but they do actually have a squeal tab on here, and that's going to sit that direction up against the piston. As you can see, I've got the shape of the piston with my disc brake quiet, and that should adhere to the piston and stop any noise. Not sure if you can see it too well, but this actually has, as I mentioned, some spring clips that hold the pads or tension against the pads. In this case, this little fella here is going to have to be raised up like this, and then we can squeeze the pad in against it so it'll hold tension to stop it rattling. So that's our back pad put in against the piston side. The main thing was, of course, to lift up that spring clip so that this little leg here assembly could slide into the frame. That's now held in tight by that spring clip. So this side next. You can see both spring clips have been pushed into place. They've been squished together, and then the brake pad has been pushed into place. It's the same with the other side. I've also checked the back pad, and that is correctly installed as well. So all we have to do now is grab the caliper, make sure that the hose is not twisted, it's back in its original place, and slide it over the disc, making sure that the disc is still clean. We can now pop our bolts back into the caliper assembly itself, put our wheel on, and then we can go through the bedding in procedure. I'll let you know about that in a while. If you're unsure about how tight to do these bolts, you may need a tension wrench and the correct specifications. But for today, I'm relying on experience and the MiracleMAX guns. At this point, the rotor should rotate quite easily. Shouldn't be jammed up by the caliper or the pads. As you can see, I've got some grot marks on there, dirty hands, so I'll give that a quick clean with some brake clean, and so that it's ready for the wheel to go back on. I've now completed the other side. Now that I've pushed the piston back in the caliper, you can see the fluid level in the brake master cylinder is quite high. Don't remove any at this point, as long as it doesn't overflow. I'll show you why. So we need to slowly push down our brake pedal. You may notice that it goes straight to the floor. Don't panic. Just bring it up very slowly. What's happening is the piston is now being pushed out in the bore of the caliper, and it is touching up against the brake pad and the rotor. You'll now notice that it's back to its solid state. So what's going to happen to the fluid that was in the master cylinder? Well, that's going to lower. So you can now see the level has dropped a little. I may still have to draw some out. The important thing is to get it to the correct level. So the wheel goes on next. Heavy sucker. There we go. Then we simply put all the nuts back on. Do it up with our wheel brace before we lower it on the ground. Make sure you do what's called the star pattern, which means it's opposite to where I was last. It creates a star when you've finished it. Okay, so now I can come over here, then across to here, across to here, and finally straight down across there. That's the star pattern. Okay, so it's now safe to lower on the ground. In one of my other videos I show you how to change a car wheel, and the question was asked is how tight do I do the nuts? Well, unless you have a tension wrench, which I'm going to show you how to use one of those shortly, but you're back to your wheel brace, aren't you? So if you're not really strong, it's pretty hard to figure out how tight to do it. What you can do is go as tight as you can, and then if you're really not quite sure, put your foot on one side, hold the other side with your hand, and just push down like that. Once again, as tight as you can. Then push down with your foot, plus your hand on the other side, and just nip it up like that. That should be tight enough to get you out of trouble. Once again, doing that star pattern. For those of you that do own a tension wrench, it's important to follow manufacturer's specifications. But a good rule of thumb is around about 110 Newton meters, which is what I've got this set to. So let's see how far out I was with the wheel brace. Oops, this one. So you can hear that I actually got them within specifications just using the wheel brace. So you don't have to panic about not doing it tight enough if you follow that method. And of course, when you've completed that, don't forget your wheel chocks. Next step in the process is the bedding in procedure. Most manufacturers of brake pads or discs will give you a bedding in procedure. The goal is to allow the discs and the pads to bed into one another and the discs themselves to warm up and to heat up at a regular rate. So you can see there's a process there which involves, going from 40 k's, put your foot lightly on the brake, then 60 k's brake, 80 k's brake, then letting it cool down. But as it also says there, you want to avoid sudden braking for the first 100 kilometres to allow it to bed in, which is a little bit difficult for these people because they're farm people. They live out where there's plenty of skippies hopping across the road, so they may have to do hard braking, but the point of the matter is that you don't do it on purpose. So that's the process that I'm just about to go through now. I'll go for my road test next. So I'm back from a successful road test and I'm happy with the results. There was no vibration or undue noise that didn't belong there, and the braking was nice and smooth. I followed the manufacturer's recommendation for bedding in the brake pads to the letter, and that will help the brakes themselves last much longer. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to give it a like, and you are more than welcome to put a comment down below. I always look at them and I really appreciate your input. Until next time, this is MiracleMAX signing off. Catch you later.